Well, I've highlighted for you guys my picks of the best movies of 2018, but now it's time to point out what I consider to be the worst of the worst, so you guys know what not to buy for your personal movie collections. These are the bottom 5 movies of 2018. Number 5. Annihilation. This movie is low on the list because it actually has a lot of strengths working in its favour. In particular, it has a fantastic premise, some great visuals, and some amazing body horror that is on the same level as movies like The Thing and Reanimator. But its ultimate issue is that it just focuses on all the wrong things. Rather than developing its horror elements into a constant thrill ride where you could be on the edge of your seat biting your nails in anticipation, it instead spends a good chunk of its time trying to be this artistic masterpiece that has a message and is trying to explore some clever themes that it ultimately doesn't know what those are. And that's without even pointing out some of the flaws in the narrative, like you will be questioning and scratching your head as to why they do things, like why they send an all-female team out to explore the Shimmer, or what was the deal with the alien at the end of the film. Annihilation ultimately will just go down as one of the handful of movies that studios weren't confident were going to do well in cinemas and so just dumped onto Netflix. Number 4. Solo, a Star Wars story. The end result of the utterly poor leadership at Lucasfilm. This movie is constantly torn between two different visions by two completely different directing teams, which ultimately leads to the movie just feeling rather boring and disjointed as it goes from one very humorous scene to a much more serious and down-to-earth scene. Coupled with this, some very poor characterization and the fact that this was a story that nobody wanted to see, let alone asked for. Alden Ehrenreich was woefully miscast as a young Han Solo. I don't get the impression that he's a bad actor, but he was not the right guy to play this role. Pack on top of that a terribly written script that takes whatever potential this story could have had and just wastes it on disappointing outcomes. If you thought the Mexican standoff scene showcased in the trailer was going to have an amazing payoff, you will be disappointed, more so by the ending where Han doesn't even get to take down the big baddie in his own origin story. His girlfriend does it for him instead. Number 3. The Cloverfield Paradox. Really, this was just an absolute bore to sit through. And it follows the same trend as Cloverfield Lane, where Bad Robot had a completely independent and standalone script but decided to just connect it to the Cloverfield name just in order to make a few extra bucks of the fans of that admittedly pretty good movie. But now thanks to this, that movie is now worse in hindsight. Its connection to that film is tangential to non-existent at best. And on top of that, the characters are just flat out unlikable. I did not care for what happened to any of them, no matter how creative their ultimate fates were. Sure, there's some interesting visuals here and there and some creative ideas, but it's all for naught when we don't actually care about the characters and we're just sitting through this utterly bored. If this had been kept as a standalone independent movie, it would have fared better. Sure, it would still have some of the problems it currently has, but at least things wouldn't be as lazy and confusing as they are now. The Cloverfield Paradox will go down in infamy as the first movie that was just so terrible that it was dumped onto Netflix as an exclusive, and for also killing whatever potential for a franchise the original Cloverfield movie could have had. Number 2. A Wrinkle in Time. And speaking of boring movies, this one was even worse than the Cloverfield Paradox. I actually looked into the source material after watching this, and what I saw was actually incredibly creative and has the potential for something of true greatness if adapted properly, but this movie is not that adaptation. Whatever science fantasy elements the book had has just been poorly translated under the vision of the director Ava DuVernay. The characters are just boring to watch, and you really will not be interested in what they're going through. With the main character in particular, her story has been transformed into something that is just predictable, where you can see what's going to happen from over a mile away. Something that cannot be made up for by some of the most impressive visuals in all the world, which admittedly just end up coming off as a complete drug trip rather than anything whimsical or wonderful. In fact, I dare say the overarching story of the original source material has been butchered, with characters that just come off as bizarre or low-functioning autistic, to characters who literally just come out of nowhere and say they feel like they need to be there. I'm not joking, that's how one character is introduced. All the woke points and Oprah Winfrey casting cannot save what is ultimately a terrible, terrible adaptation of a movie, especially when its main villain is literally called the Evil It, and it's defeated with the biggest anime trope of all time, the power of friendship. And now before I give you my number 1 pick, here are a few dishonorable mentions.
Never trust a man, even when he looks flat down there.
That's the thing that killed my men. Alien.
Number 1. Ugh. Ocean's 8, where to start? Well, I guess with what it represents. Ocean's 8 is the living embodiment of the worst trend enveloping Hollywood right now. The desire to try to draw more women in to check out what were originally just male-centered properties by putting strong female characters at the forefront of almost everything. The problem though is that these strong female characters aren't strong female characters. They're just women who have everything go their way, which in turn leads for an incredibly boring no-thrills heist that, despite trying to be something that's empowering women, is quite stereotypical. What do you think is more heart-pounding and high risk? Robbing a casino's vault or stealing a necklace from a fashion show? The characters are all just flat, two-dimensional and unlikable. The performances by the actresses, you can tell they're doing their best, but they're terrible in this. And the two worst aspects of the movie are that not only is it criminally boring to the point where you're practically falling asleep while watching it, but it's also technically Ocean's 14. It shares the same universe as the George Clooney films, with the protagonist being the sister to his version of Danny Ocean, something that will offend fans of the Ocean's 13 trilogy. Ultimately, this movie was just a complete bore-fest that, in trying to cater to a demographic that really had no interest in it, more than likely has killed off this franchise for the foreseeable future. And I'll end this summary by saying this. I dragged my mum with me to go and see this. She fell asleep 3 or 4 times in the cinema. That speaks volumes of the quality on offer by what is hands down the most boring movie of 2018,